Hello, I'm George Mason, host of Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. Can you imagine a married Catholic priest with 4 children? We'll be exploring that with Father Joshua Whitfield. Welcome to Good God. We're joined today by Father Joshua Whitfield, who is a Catholic priest and the pastoral administrator at St. Rita's Catholic Church here in Dallas, Texas. He is also a frequent columnist for the Dallas Morning News. And Josh, it's a delight to welcome you to Good God.
Good to see you. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
I think probably the most interesting thing by way of introduction for most people would be to say that there is more of a backstory to you being a Catholic priest than to most, in that you are a married Catholic priest with 4 children, all of this sanctioned by the Vatican.
Yep.
And so tell us about your conversion from Anglicanism to the Roman Catholic Church, and maybe start with your call to ministry and how all of that came to be.
Yeah, so I'm a married Catholic priest. That's different, you know. I started out as really in the Disciples of Christ Church. I was baptized in the Disciples of Christ Church.
All right. So you were immersed.
Texas. I was immersed.
So we're sort of Baptist
exactly.
kid originally.
Exactly. I was by saintly George Richardson, great minister who's gone to the Lord. And so I was baptized at 9 years old.
Okay.
Shortly thereafter, I became an Episcopalian. And I loved the high ritual and the beauty of the Episcopal Church I grew up in. And it's really in that context that I discovered a love of Jesus in the church. And, you know, I was a church kid, you know, and late in my high school years, the priest I had actually said, "I know you're going to be a priest." And he suggested the vocation, and that really was the beginning of the end, so to speak. And I followed that, went to college, went to seminary in the UK, came back and served, you know, in finding myself in the midst of a Episcopal Church, you know, embroiled in controversy, which,
right.
You know, I mean, welcome to the club.
Yes, every tradition
yeah,
in
exactly,
America,
you know,
right.
That's the name of the game.
Yes.
But so you retreat from that to go to Duke to study and think some more, and then I come back to a beautiful little Episcopal church in Mansfield, Texas, and I loved it. I loved being a parish priest. The academic world is fun, but my heart's always been with people in a parish, and so I pursued that, and I loved it, and I lived it, but as I was going through, you know, as an Episcopalian, as on the high end of the Episcopalian Church, you know, it's a very Catholic experience. It's a very Catholic way of thinking, and so for me, being so close to Catholic tradition, Catholic thought, Catholic theology, you naturally ask the question, why not Catholic?
Yes.
Right?
So maybe we should pause to just help the viewers understand that when you say within the Episcopal Church, you are on the Catholic side, you might say.
Right.
So there is the Episcopal Church sort of lives between the Catholic Church and the Protestant tradition.
Right.
Technically Protestant because it's separated from Rome, but retaining much of Roman liturgy, and so.
There's a great breadth of experience in the Episcopal Church and in Anglicanism generally.
Yes.
You see it in the Church of England. It's much more pronounced in the Church of England, where you can have Anglican churches that are as evangelical as anything you've seen, and then you can have Anglican churches that are as Catholic in their ritual. As anything you've ever seen. And so I was more on that high Catholic end. I loved the smells and the bells and the vestments. And it was really beautiful, and I still very much appreciate that. And so, the Episcopal Church is a broad thing, and it formed me beautifully. I'm deeply grateful for the experience, and I say being a good Anglican made me a good Catholic, and And so for me, it was about going back in history, going back to the roots, to the original, ecclesia, the original church, and I had to overcome my some of them good, some of them ill-founded Protestant suspicions of Roman Catholics.
Right, right. So it sounds to me, curiously, I think when most people think about Episcopal priests who convert to Rome, there is, at least for me, a kind of an assumption that is more of a doctrinal decision, that the Episcopal Church maybe has drifted toward doctrinal relativism and liberalism and the like. But it's also, in listening to you, I hear you talking a little more about the connection to the ancient church, about the continuity of the tradition and the sense of home that represents for you, that's more than doctrinal but is ecclesial.
Right. Ecclesial is the key. For me, it was ecclesiology that did it for me, right? So and this is what converted the great John Henry Newman.
Yes.
His view is, it's what's my view as well. His view was that the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, which is this Italian phenomenon, as he saw it with all his English prejudice, what was an organic human sociological fact that you could trace. And there's beautiful bits about it and squalid bits about it, but it is what it is. And it's like a family. And so and you can't pick and choose your family, you can't divorce your family and get a new family, you can't create a family on paper. And the church is, the Catholic Church is that organic sociological fact, which is the body of Christ. And the Church of England, as he saw it, was an experiment on paper. And when church becomes an idea rather than a sociological fact, then you can argue about ideas and divide yourself over ideas repeatedly. And so when Newman saw that, he said it was like seeing a ghost. And for me, that was my experience. So I became a Roman Catholic because I came to believe in the organic sociological fact of the ecclesia, which is centered in the Eucharist, centered in communion with the successor Peter, the Pope. And that took a lot of historical looking and a lot of soul searching to get over those quite natural Protestant fears about the Pope in Rome and things like that. And so for me, that's what that was. And the cultural wars that we all as Christians experience, for me, that really just opened the door to think about those deeper structural things.
So when we talk about ecclesial or ecclesiastical, this is language for people who are not insiders to our trade. This is really talking about the church itself, the gathered church, the present physical body of Christ, as we call it, and how it's organized and how it relates both to the priesthood and the lay people to God and the sacraments and the like. So one of the stumbling blocks for Protestantism, and you said you overcame this, and obviously in your decision, was this sense of the succession of Peter and the primacy of the Pope in the church and all of that. So I think most Protestants are much more democratic, small d, in terms of their view of the priesthood of all believers and the like. And so I think it would be helpful to many of our Protestant viewers and listeners to hear your sense of how a structural priesthood that begins with the Pope and moves down through the church hierarchy, how you can interpret that less in terms of a kind of authoritative structure of rule and more as a pastoral shepherding overseer kind of approach to things, because I think most Protestants only view it in terms of a kind of autocratic rule.
Right. Well, in the papacy in the modern age, it's with Vatican I and infallibility and immediate jurisdiction of the Pope and things like that, and the Pope tweets and it goes around the world in a second. So it's easy to see the papacy in the modern experience of it, and as a Protestant have those fears, and I certainly did. For me, it was about looking at the concept of the ministerial priesthood and the priesthood of all believers. Of course, Catholics always have believed in the priesthood of all believers because of faith and baptism, but we would point to Matthias, for example, replacing Judas. For some reason, it was important to replace Judas and to have the 12.
Yes.
Right? So there obviously within the body was a distinction of the 12 in relation to the 70, in relation to the thousands.
Yes.
Right? And then if you look at Peter, there's a Petrine, a trajectory of the ministry of Peter. When Jesus gave him the keys in Matthew 16, he was speaking in the future tense. It's hard, for me at least, to imagine that Jesus would have given Peter this Petrine ministry.
Yes.
Which, by the way, you see him perform in Acts of the Apostles and things like that, only to take it away after the first generation.
Yes.
Especially when you read on and you read 2 Peter, for example, who, writing to churches in Asia, Christians in Asia.
Right.
If that's Peter in Rome writing it, that's Peter in Rome writing it. If it's not Peter in Rome writing it, it's someone in Peter's name writing it.
Yes.
If you read the letter of Clement, for example, here's a Christian in Rome, a head of a church, in some form or fashion, writing to churches in Asia. In Greece. Why, right?
Yes, right.
And so there's obviously something Petrine in the Scripture and in the early tradition, and so. Ignatius of Antioch talked about the Church of Rome presiding in love.
Right.
Irenaeus of Lyon in the early 2nd century, early 3rd century, talked about all the churches needing to agree with Rome because that's where Peter and Paul died.
Right.
And so the tradition is very suggestive.
Right.
And so. But then you've got the rest of our history, and you have some remarkable sin there when it comes
all right.
to
Let's not just focus on the sin of the Catholic Church, because if we go there, we're also going to have to go to the sin of the Protestant Church and to all the separatist churches and the non-denominational churches, because sin is sin and humans are humans and that sort of thing. I think maybe it would be helpful also to just say, from my point of view, as one whom the Catholic Church has called part of what's known as ecclesial communities.
Right,
That is, we're not really the church as Baptists. Only the Roman Catholic Church is the church. But that's part of a sort of dogmatic understanding of what the nature of the church is. It's not intended to be a slight. It feels like it to a Protestant,
of course it does,
but we also interpret the very same traditions you've talked about, and certainly you know this because you've been on our side of this. The notion of giving the keys of the kingdom to Peter, being more about granting them to the church rather than to the individual, and what's more, that the identity of the leadership of the church and the organization of it mirroring Roman culture and Roman governance structure in the early days suggests that the church sort of made up its organizational structure in a functional way that was more sociological, but which is also something that the church has the right or privilege of being able to restructure and change over time. But what we find, I think, now is, and we're coming up on a break here, is I think we're seeing more of each other's point of view than we ever have. We're 500 years from the Reformation, right? And aren't we seeing a remarkable conversation taking place now between the churches that have separated and protested and all of that, and the internal conversation in the Roman Church, and how we're finding common ground again? What are your thoughts there?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, for me, we are both recipients of the gift of the ecumenical movement, which began in the late 19th century, which the Protestants began. The Catholics came late to the game, and it all happened at these worldwide conferences. Our age now is the time for the ecumenical movement, I believe, to hit the pews, right, where you and I can sit down and talk.
Exactly.
Your people can talk to my people.
Right.
And we can have these sorts of conversations and have fun with it. So it's a new age.
Well, let's pick that up after the break. And I want to talk more about your identity as a priest as well, and a married one at that, and father. So thanks so much.
Thanks,
Okay.
Cristo Rey Dallas provides a Catholic college preparatory education to students of all faiths who live at or below the federal poverty level. Students work in 140 of Dallas' premier businesses 1 day each week to earn 65% of the cost of their educations. 100% of Cristo Rey Dallas students will be admitted to college, and 97% will be the first in their families to attend college. The students will be prepared to serve and to lead in college and in life. To find out more, visit CristoRayDallas.org.
We're back with Joshua Whitfield, and Josh, we were talking about the movement toward a kind of new conversation in at least American religion, and that is one that includes the Catholic Church with Protestant churches in an ecumenical way, and driving it down to the pew more. The truth is, I think, in your experience and mine, many lay people have kind of preceded us in this.
Absolutely.
They have a sense that there's not Catholic and then there's Christian. There are different kinds of Christians, and that's been progress because there was a time when people used to think of intermarriage as Protestants marrying Catholics.
Right. Absolutely. No, we're in a far better time than even some of the old timers in my parish will invoke horror stories of generations past, and I tell them, look, it's a new Catholic Church, it's a new world.
Yes.
Let's get together.
So we used the word ecclesial earlier, and you have called yourself an ecclesial zoo exhibit.
Indeed, I am.
That is to say, you're an anomaly, not a unicorn, but you are a married priest and have 4 children, you and Allie. And I think many people maybe have heard that this is possible, but explain the process and how all of that came to be.
Well, really it's because of John Paul II. If the Vatican II opening themselves up to the experience of the ecumenical movement and what that could mean. Also, John Paul II in the early 80s established what he called the pastoral provision, which allows for married clergy from other traditions, mostly Anglicanism, but others as well, if they become Catholic, have an opportunity to discern with the Church whether or not they're called to live out the ministerial priesthood in the Catholic Church. And so I did that, and the Church discerned with me and let that happen. And so I'm a priest as a priest as a priest in Dallas. The big difference is I've got a very noisy, lovely house with 4 kids under 8 years old and a saintly wife who takes care of all of us. And so it's a different sort of experience, but it's a beautiful one, and I'm grateful to it. It's a witness to the church's commitment to Christian unity,
Yes.
right? And allowing for ministry like mine to flourish.
Right.
And so I'm grateful to it.
So, given that, you celebrate the fact that it's a witness to the oneness of the church, but at the same time, you also see the value of a celibate priesthood.
Absolutely.
And are not asking that rule be changed, you being an exception to the rule, but the rule itself being changed. But if you celebrate the married priesthood, then clearly you don't have this sense that there is a deep reality of absolutism about the priesthood celibacy. So what is your sense of the unique witness of a celibate priesthood then that is important?
Well, celibacy in Western Catholic thought has always been a matter of discipline.
Yes.
And so it's never been part of to speak strangely, it's never been part of the ontology of the priesthood. It's never, as you said, deeply rooted in the priesthood. It's been a matter of discipline for the sake of, the quote-unquote liberty of the church. A celibate, under certain circumstances, is more free to make the sacrifices necessary for the freedom of the church. There is a symbolism to celibacy, which is valuable in the church insofar as it shows us that God relies not on human generation to rebuild His church anew, and so from a discipline standpoint and from a sign value standpoint, I think if we got rid of celibacy, we would miss it very suddenly.
Okay, so saying that, there is a kind of freedom, as you say, for ministry purposes, that someone who is single, which is technically what celibacy means, and then refrains from sexual activity, which is actually something else, but nonetheless entails in that. This allows a person to focus on the church, but there is a lot of tradition of the language of the priest representing Christ as a male figure who is married to the church, and then therefore at the Eucharist that there's this sort of a male-female imagery involved in this. Once again, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that this still is a bit more of a metaphor as opposed to a deep reality that is inviolable.
Right, sure. It's an aesthetic.
Okay.
The priesthood as father of community, married to the church, creating children by means of the Eucharist. That applies to a married priest too, but in a broader way. There's actually a theologian in Florence who's writing beautiful theology on married priesthood, about how the married priesthood, his family, is simply expanded to embrace the family of the parish, the family of the church, which is beautiful. But again, for me, it's an aesthetic. It's a valuable metaphor.
Would that metaphor then preclude the possibility at some time in the future of female priests, women priests, because it's still gender exclusive, even if it's an aesthetic?
Yeah. Well, we're getting into nuanced weeds here. With celibacy as a matter of discipline that has with it a sign value, an aesthetic, that is something that is not ontological. Whether or not a priest is a man or a woman, that is at that ontological level, as the church thinks. And so whether or not a priest is married doesn't affect whether or not the priest is a man, right? And so and with female priests, the possibility of female priests, yeah, I mean that's the church doesn't score that as the same way that married priests do.
Right.
But the glorious thing about being a Catholic, this is different from being an Episcopalian, is that I just do what I'm told in a certain sense, right? When I was an Episcopalian, it mattered what I thought on such things. Now it doesn't, and that's liberating.
I think most Americans would say that that is inhibiting rather than liberating. Say more about this sense of freedom that you have, that you give over a certain authority about what you think to the church.
Well, the church, as we understand it, again, this is a metaphorical way of thinking about it. The church is mother, right? So the church is, there's several sort of metaphors at play at the same time. Church is body of Christ, the church is bride of Christ, the church is mother. And so therefore, if the church is mother, the way I'm a father to my kids, or my mother is a mother to our kids, there are certain moments in parenting where what matters really is obedience. Understanding may not be as important at that point in time.
Yes.
My little daughter reaches her hand out to touch the stove. I'm going to speak to her in clear language not to.
Right.
I don't really care whether or not she understands whether or not the stove's going to burn her, you know. And so there are moments when the church acts like that as well.
Right.
And so understanding everything is not as important as understanding that she is the church and that we are called to, at some points, just obey, right?
And yet, there is an extraordinary intellectual tradition of the church of faith-seeking understanding that you participate in as a scholar and as a priest and as a writer and all of that. So, so there's a kind of beginning point of recognition of authority, but it doesn't mean you stop thinking.
Oh, absolutely.
You stop pursuing. You stop asking questions.
Yeah, let's take the women priest experience, for example. The church is quite clear that she's not going to be open to women priests. John Paul II even said that it wasn't even a discussion. I mean, he put it in the most firm terms possible. And so my job is to say, okay, well, I get that, I accept that. Why?
Yes.
Right? And that takes you into, you know, a rather debated terrain of tradition and theology. The ontology of priesthood as a type of fatherhood, whereas, you know, the church would suggest that the priesthood of women is motherhood. You know, just as the priest gives birth to the community in the Eucharist, the mother gives birth biologically and things like that. And again, and there's all sorts of debate whether or not that's aesthetic or at what level is it ontological. Those are all arguments that we can continue to have and should have.
And yet I think what's happening too is the creativity of the church in finding more ways for women to take leadership at the same time, to participate in worship and in liturgical ways, not the priesthood perhaps, but nonetheless leadership in the church and local congregations.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and Pope Francis himself called for that, and I think we're a long ways from that, or we could do better, let's put it that way. As far as local parish leadership, women being in positions where they can truly make calls. The Diocese of Dallas, we've had a wonderful woman serve as chancellor for years and years and years. And so, you know, in practice in the Catholic world, I think there are some shining examples, and I think there are also examples where we need to grow. You know, but these are all conversations we can have as we strive to be obedient to the Church. You know,
and the same is true in our traditions as well. I think whether we're talking about the role of women or the responsibility of pastoral life and those who lead, there's a lot of room to grow. Anyway, this is a beginning of a conversation, and we're going to have another episode to pursue some other things. So thank you so much, Josh, for your time today.
I love it. Thank you, sir.
Grateful.
Cheers.
Cristo Rey Dallas provides a Catholic college preparatory education to students of all faiths who live at or below the federal poverty level. Students work in 140 of Dallas' premier businesses one day each week to earn 65% of the cost of their educations. 100% of Cristo Rey Dallas students will be admitted to college, and 97% will be the first in their families to attend college. The students will be prepared to serve and to lead in college and in life. To find out more, visit CristoRayDallas.org.